Hi! This video is a walkthrough of my design project from the very beginning phases of brainstorming and concept generation all the way through to the actual execution of the project itself, which was a stop motion animation, and then my afterthoughts on how the actual process went. So the first step was to have a brainstorming session, and during that I created a mind map. I decided on things like the theme of the piece, what style was I going to use to create the video. Was it going to be animation, stop motion animation, time lapse, slideshow, story time, and other things like the logistics of the piece. What kind of tools was I going to need? What kind of time would I need to allocate to the overall process and the smaller parts within? And try to anticipate some of the costs and some of the hurdles that I might face, which then led to me talking to my classmates and using them as sounding boards for some of my ideas. Then there's just some sketches and quick rough work that I did for potential characters for the piece and the kind of vibe that I was hoping to achieve within the animation. Next up was the mood board. Now, the mood board is a visual representation of some of the themes and the kind of feel of the piece overall. What do I want to display in this? That's a quick sketch of the room done out. But if you have a look, there's a lot of Georgian furniture, that kind of old vintage feel, a lot of monsters with disproportionate facial features, which was something that I like to play around with as an antagonist by just distorting kind of slightly humanoid faces and creatures. It has a real creep factor. Then I have some strips of material that I used on the actual characters in the end, and other stuff that's more so like wallpaper. Then we go on to the characters, where I laid out their design roughly from my head and the materials that I intended to use, how I was going to construct them and what I wanted them to look like. So you'll notice with Mia and Daddy, they have quite large, innocent eyes, and none of them have noses. Whereas with Tak, the antagonist, he has more elongated arms and limbs, and he's more humanoid than anything. Then we have a couple of pictures of the polymer clay process and inserting the eyes and building the bodies with wire and foam. This was the first draft for the storyboard, which I did entirely in pencil. And I tried to play around with the furniture that I wanted on set and how I was going to include that in shots, as well as just setting out the scenes and how I wanted them to play out and how to give a sense of tension through the shots and how I was going to assemble them all together. I then went on and did a in colour version, which actually kind of ended up doing a mixed media piece with, in that I started trying to use markers, but the paper was quite thin, so I ended up doing it all in colouring pencil and trying to be semi-accurate with the fabrics that I used on the characters themselves. And I just played around then with the idea of lighting and shading and the aspects of the shots that I wanted to be highlighted. This is a brief explanation of my furniture and my actual set design and creation. The wardrobe was going to be a very focal piece in the actual set, both visually, and I wanted it to be usable and functional because I did want to set the scene where Daddy opens the wardrobe in quite slow motion to create tension. The lighting was all fairy lights that I'd popped into holes in the set, which was a box. Things like the curtains, the bed, the duvet, the mattress, the pillow, all hand-stitched by me, and I even made a bed frame to make sure that it held it up. The lighting was mostly fairy lights, but I did have a couple of lamps on around the outside of the set just to create the right dimension and the right amount of shadow. The little pictures I painted myself. I gave a rust effect using different types of acrylic, and the furniture was also painted, crackled, painted again, and then given a distressed look. This is another storyboard that I was playing around with. a much happier, lighter feel. So again, I did a draft of that in pencil, and I went on then to do a watercolor, smaller storyboard, because I wanted to use the watercolors and I wanted it to be quite vibrant, so I didn't have A2 paper for a watercolor, so I went with the smaller size. And here we have some of my notes from actually doing the recording and the process of editing. I did have a couple of issues like characters unraveling, not being able to hold them in place, and I then corrected that the best way I could with things like hot glue and wire, and eventually it turned out okay, but I did learn that if I were to do it again in future, I would want to have certain rigs for the characters and maybe a stronger core in the characters that they could balance. The audio I kept note of because I needed timestamps. I recorded everything myself, including the backing music and sound effects, so it was important that I had them accurate time-wise. Then I have some sketches of some Tim Burton characters that I did, Burton having been a huge influence on why I chose to do horror and why I chose to do it as a stop-motion piece, because he managed to convey not just a creepiness but also a great innocence with his characters in his stop-motion pieces, and I like how he was always able to create deep but visually engaging characters. And then there's notes on things that I did like about the process, things that I learned, things that I would change if doing it again, stuff like how I built my set, my characters. And another important point was why I chose to go from 10 frames per second to 5 frames per second. And this was a very deliberate design choice, not because I wanted to save the amount of time during the actual recording process, but more so because I liked how it gave a disjointed feel to some of the movements, and I feel like that added a certain amount of tension even in the more benign and safe scenes. So that's the overall quick rundown of my thought process and my design process and all the things in between.